that tool is open to NCRC members. In this case, we're looking at the top 20 mortgage originators in Lucas County during the years 2018 and 2020. Huntington National Bank is far and away the leader, followed by Fifth Third, Quicken, KeyBank, Citizens, and the rest. And we're looking here at a couple things I want to call your attention to. And I'm going to go to the next slide here, where we break out the percentage of loans that have either a Black or a Hispanic applicant, or that lack any demographic data. So the gray bar in the background is the average figure. So it's really easy to look down here and see which lenders are above or below average. A couple things to note. If we go back a couple of slides here, in the county as a whole, 19% of residents are Black and 7% are Hispanic. Amongst these top 20 lenders, we see nobody approaching those figures in their lending activity. The closest would be First Federal Bank of the Midwest, and at the bottom, Freedom Mortgage. And even those, I wouldn't say are anywhere that close to that 19% figure, and nobody is really making inroads amongst Hispanic applicants or residents in the area. However, you do see on the left-hand side, several lenders are not doing a spectacular job at even collecting basic demographic data. Fifth Third Mortgage and Quicken in particular lack a lot of data on these loans, so it's a little difficult to really know how accurate those figures are. So in our most recent mortgage report, the 2020 mortgage report that we released a month or two ago, specifically we note that a lot of lenders are really dropping the ball when it comes to collecting this basic demographic data, and we are pushing for that to be addressed by the CFPB. The tool also allows you to map mortgage lending in the area, and this is just a dot density map where the dots indicate the mortgage lending, home purchase mortgage lending in the census tracts of Lucas County. The blue here indicates minority population. Darker blue means more minority population. What should be immediately apparent is that within these darker blue areas, which are mostly within the city of Toledo itself, there is very little lending, or there is much less lending than we see outside of those areas. In particular, the eastern part of Toledo, there is virtually no home purchase lending going on at all. Now, in the interactive tool, you can dive in a lot closer on these maps and examine individual neighborhoods. You can also look at them in comparison to neighborhood median incomes, and get a lot more detail out of it. But I'm not totally surprised by this, because when we get into the redlining and segregation section, it's going to actually, the old redlining maps actually look very similar to this pattern. So just a final note on that fair lending tool. If you're an NCRC organizational or a Just Economy Club member, you do have access to it. There's a link right here. You can click on that, sign into our website, and it dives into a lot more detail than I'm going to cover here about mortgage lending, small business lending, and bank branch locations. If you have any questions about that or would like to learn more about it, just email me after this call, and I'm happy to talk about it. So redlining, we've done quite a bit of work on redlining, and that's collected at this redlining hub that's on our website. Redlining was, if you're not familiar, I'll briefly describe it. The 1930s policy of the Homeowners Loan Corporation was to map communities and as a way to guide where they would like to buy mortgages. In practice, the HOLC used these maps very little before they shut down. But the Federal Housing Administration did take on all of these mapping methods when they chose how to make their loan activity. In fact, and I mention this because there's a bit of a pushback from some reports that have come out recently that these maps had no bearing on lending. The FHA actually, in an official speech not long after the end of the HOLC, Fair Housing Administration officials thanked the HOLC for developing these redlining methods that they were then adopting at the FHA. The FHA used these methods throughout most of the first half of the 20th century until 1968. After the Fair Housing Act was passed, the FHA collected most of their maps and destroyed them. The maps we have left are the original ones from the HOLC that cover about 200 or so cities, but the FHA would have used these nationally in almost every city that exists today. So when we look at this, it's a good guide for what happened across the country. But in this case, luckily, we're looking at Toledo. There is a good HOLC map for Toledo and several other North Ohio cities that we're going to discuss today. So just a little note here. This is what the original maps look like. This is not Toledo. This is Dallas, but I just put it in here as a sample. They were used to guide mortgage purchases, and you would get redlined for a number of reasons. And I like to mention this also because it's, again, that you hear a kind of a revisionist history of redlining, that it wasn't just about race. True. You redlining, the notes in there do indicate, if there was industrial uses or if there were any non-US born populations, including German, Eastern European, Jew, Catholic, anything like that that was considered foreign, they could get redlined. But we're going to take a look at some of the original redlining documentation from the Toledo area in just a minute. You're going to see that it was really sharply focused on race, in particular African Americans. So we partner with the University of Richmond. Their mapping inequality project, it was the first and the best, in my opinion, attempt to digitize the original HOLC redlining maps. And we've worked with them on several projects in the past couple of years. You can click on this link. We're going to do this right now because I want to zoom in here and take a look at Ohio. And we want to take a look at Toledo specifically. So this is the map of Toledo, and you can actually change the map here to kind of get the modern street grid behind it, and you can understand which areas of town today were redlined in the 1930s. So in particular, I'm going to take a look at this section D2. It's a redlined area just to the west of what is now downtown Toledo. And if we click on it, you're going to get some information over here. These are notes from the original assessor who created the maps. These are some remarks that he made. You'll note throughout these documents, racist language is explicit throughout them. In fact, you'll see it here also. And if we pull up the scan of the original document, and I'm just doing this because I want to show you one thing here. If we close this was the original document typed up by the examiner. And when people say that it wasn't strictly about race, and I say, yes, that's true. However, it really was pretty sharply focused on race. So if you'll note here, an actual section on the form was there to identify the presence of African Americans. It was explicit policy to deny mortgage lending in areas with a substantial African American population. So I bring this up just to give you some warning if you encounter folks who say, well, it wasn't just about race. In fact, it really was. It was very explicitly focused on race in many ways. So what's the effect of this? I mean, what do we care, really, right? Well, today, nationally, neighborhoods that were redlined, what they called hazardous on the maps, 74.7% of those areas are low to moderate income today. Declining neighborhoods, those that were yellow on the maps, are still almost 54% low to moderate income today. They are also overwhelmingly majority non-white, mostly Black and Hispanic. Hazardous areas, almost 64% of those areas that were hazardous in the 1930s today are majority minority. And you see the same pattern in Toledo. If we take look at that Toledo redlining map, and then you look at a map today of race and income in the Toledo area, they do line up very nicely. The exception are areas such as Baltimore's Inner Harbor, which were redlined in the 1930s due to excessive industrial use. When the industrial use was removed, the area gentrified, and today it's upper income and majority white. And you'll see areas of like that or pockets of that in many cities, where redlined areas for one reason or another have become highly desirable, usually because their proximity to downtown or waterfront areas or things like that. So we expanded on our work on with the redlining to start looking at its connection to public health issues today. And our public health and redlining report is linked to here. And I do want to bring up Toledo here as well, because I think there's some interesting facts here about the impact on the health of residents of Toledo. So with our reports, we usually include some sort of interactive tools that let you dig a little bit further into the data. For here, these are all the maps that we've got. And let's go down to Ohio. And you'll see the list here of different cities in Ohio that we have maps for. We're going to stick with Toledo today. And again, here is the Toledo redlining map on the left-hand side. Let's zoom in a little bit easier so we can see it. And then on the right-hand side, these colors indicate the social vulnerability index. So the social vulnerability index is a measure that's used by the CDC to measure the ability of a community to resist disasters such as disease outbreaks or other types of man-made or natural disasters. A very high social vulnerability index usually indicates a much higher danger of poor public health outcomes, shorter life expectancy, higher poverty rates, any number of things. So let's take a look again at that same neighborhood in Toledo, the section to the east or west of downtown there. And again, we see the notes from the examiner of the period. And on the right-hand side, let me see here, click on that, and you'll note that, hold on a second. So first of all, at the bottom here in the middle of the screen, these little squiggly lines show on the left-hand side that the area was redlined. And today, that area is split between 4 different census tracts, all of which have very high social vulnerability scores. If we click on this, we're going to get some additional health information. So the social vulnerability score for this neighborhood is the highest in the city, just over 0.9, which on a scale that goes only up to 1. It's one of the highest minority populations as well, with 84%. It has almost the lowest life expectancy in the area. Median age is very low also because it has a low life expectancy. If you look at poverty rates, it has one of the highest poverty rates in the city. And then if you get down into specific issues, diabetes, it's one of the highest, 19% of the population is diabetic, 44.8% has high blood pressure. Kidney disease is elevated, mental health issues are higher, obesity, pulmonary disease. This is something we found nationally, and this is a direct result or a direct correlation to the red line status from the 1930s, which would have locked these areas in to be lower cost housing that further concentrated with every generation more and more low income families. So let's go back here. So this is the legacy of redlining. Neighborhoods that were redlined today are going to see higher poverty rates. They're going to see more social vulnerability and lower life expectancy. There is almost every health bit of data that we have on health outcomes in the area is higher in these neighborhoods that were formerly redlined. The exception is cancer, because if ever, in neighborhoods where people live longer, you're going to get more cancer. And so that it's kind of an inverse relationship there. So we're expanding on this work. And if you want to keep an eye on research coming from NCRC, we're looking a lot more into causal proof of these links between health outcomes and redlining. We think that that's very important to establish that the impact of federal policy on the health of people today in these neighborhoods. Just a little bit more on redlining and why it's important. The most striking thing to me was that if you go and look at specific neighborhoods that were redlined in Toledo, for example, and then compare the life expectancy with neighborhoods that were green-lined, you find a shocking difference. Rochester, New York, for example, the variance was over 14 years in life expectancy from one neighborhood to the other. In Chicago, I think I found a neighborhood where it was almost a 20-year difference in expected life expectancy. Um, the link between redlining and community investment and public health is just really becoming understood now, but it's a strikingly high level of correlation between health outcomes for people in redline neighborhoods today, and I think it's been one of the most shocking things that I've seen in my career. And I think that Toledo is a I think due to its age and due to the concentration of low to moderate income and minority populations in Toledo, I think that it's there's a pretty strong relationship there too. Um, so the pandemics, disrupted local economies. And one thing I wanted to talk about today is the branch closure rate. And we just released a report on bank branch closures from 2019 through 2021, and we take a really specific look at that post COVID outbreak period as well. And nationally, we've been seeing a long-term trend of declining branches in neighborhoods overall. But what's interesting is that trend, after a short pause at the start of the pandemic, banks began closing branches at twice the rate they had pre-pandemic. In the 10-year period prior to March of 2020, nationally, we averaged about 100 or 99 closures per day. In the time since March of 2020, that has increased to a little over 200 closures per month. Sorry, not per day, per month. So we did release a report recently, the Great Consolidation of Banks and Acceleration of Bank Branch Closures. And I want to pull this up and go through a few of the data points that we have in here and a few of the interactive tools, and look a little more closely at Lucas County and Toledo. So let's see here. And our reports, like I said, normally include some interactive tools, and we like to make it possible for you to drill down a little bit more to bring up relevant data that's important for for specific areas. But I want to stop on this. FDIC insured institutions and branches from 1984 through 2020. And you'll note here that in 1984, there were 14,261 banks in operation in the US. You'll note this started to decline shortly thereafter. Interstate banking was approved, and you start seeing mergers and acquisitions take their toll. Today, there are about 4,377 banks in operation, and almost all of the losses have been amongst the small and community banks. Those have been bought up or merged with one another, and you see an explosion in the number of mega banks, those with over $10 billion in assets. However, you see the trend in branches is a little bit different. Even during this period of consolidation from 1984 through 2008, the number of branches in operation was growing. So 2008, we had a couple of things that happened. Obviously, the Great Recession, it resulted in a slew of mergers that wound up resulting in a lot of branch closures. We also see the introduction of the iPhone in 2008. Since 2008, the use of mobile and internet banking has increased dramatically. In particular, the last survey done by the FDIC showed that the percentage of people using internet banking, where you actually sit down at a computer and access your bank, has declined because mobile banking has become so popular. There's a lot of caveats to that, though. Mobile banking is not equally accepted. There are sharp divisions by age, race, and income status on who's using it. But every year, more and more people do seem to feel comfortable with using their phones. So we expect to see a continued decline in the number of branches in operation as banks reallocate where their branches are, and as we see more and more merger activity. So one of our findings from this was that mergers and acquisitions were the greatest driver of branch closures. Banks will point out that the increased adoption of technology is part of the story also, and they're not wrong. But mergers are often touted by banks to their investors as being a positive because they are able to close branches. They see that as a massive savings. Given that, and given the regulatory controls on branch closures, I expect to see branches continue to close at a very high rate for the next several years. Let's take a look at a little bit. Scroll down here and I want to pull up one of our interactive charts and take a look at that. But you can take a look through this when you have time. We do look at a lot of different individual metro areas and give you an idea of what closure rate looks like there. Whoops, I thought it was down here. Here we go. But here, I want to look at the details of bank branch closures by neighborhood income and race. So nationally, between 2017 and 2021, we saw a total of 8.7% of branches were closed. And you'll note that the closures were disproportionately in middle and upper income majority minority neighborhoods, which lost 9.5% of their branches, and low to moderate income majority white neighborhoods, where 9.3% of branches closed. Keep in mind, though, the low to moderate income and majority minority neighborhoods, even though a smaller percentage of their branches closed, they had many fewer branches to start with. So even smaller closures erode more of their banking capacity in many cases. This is an interactive chart. In the upper right here, you see the area. We're going to type in Lucas County, Ohio, hit enter. And we see a couple of interesting things. First of all, you'll note this looks very different than the other chart. Here you see that there were 2 branches that were in middle and income majority minority communities in 2017, and those branches are still in operation. We're probably talking about just 1 or 2 neighborhoods, though. I'd have to do a detailed map of Toledo, which we'll do in just a second, and to really tell you for sure where. 25% decrease, though, in branches in low to moderate income and majority minority neighborhoods. That's a pretty substantial loss. So in census tracts in Lucas County that are both low and moderate income and which are majority minority, there were 9 branches in operation in 2021. That's a 25% reduction. And you can see here also the total number of branches in operation per year. So that sharp drop there between 2020 and 2021, this mirrors what we see nationally. That's because the 2021 figure captures that first few months of the pandemic where banks were closing lots of branches very quickly. Finally, let's take a look at a more detailed map of branch closures in Lucas County. So this is a national database that we've got of branch openings and closings from the late 1990s through the third quarter, I think, of 2021. So here we want to limit this to just closures during the pandemic. So I'm just typing in March 1st, 2020. And then we're going to go up here to the area. We type in Lucas County, Ohio, and we hit enter. And this zooms in to the Lucas County area. Now, the shading here indicates median household income. Areas that are lighter are lower income. Areas that are a darker purple are higher income. Closings are in black. Openings are in this light blue color. So here you can see several closings throughout the eastern part of Lucas County, Citizens Bank, PNC, Fifth Third, but also several closings over to the western side. But the openings here are all kind of concentrated on this western side. And we are seeing kind of a reallocation of branches as they're closed or opened in these communities during the pandemic. Branches are being opened, but in specific areas. And I think there needs to be more consideration and attention paid to where those branches are opening. And just now it's happening so fast now during the pandemic that we just don't have the ability to kind of capture all of this, in real time. One last thing I wanted to kind of show you here. Let's go back to the national look. And at the bottom, this line chart shows openings and closings by quarter. And I just want to show you, go back to the full data set here. and show you during the entire time period. When I say that during the pandemic, closings jumped to an unprecedented level, this line chart here, the black line indicates closings that reported, the blue line indicates openings. So you do see the period here during the housing boom period before 2008, there were many more openings than closings. After the recession, that switched, and for years we've seen this kind of stable pattern of more closings than openings. But in the fourth quarter of 2020, we see closings skyrocket. 1,492 branches closed during that quarter alone. That is incredibly high compared to the average of 700 to 800 per quarter that were closing prior to that. So when I say that, during the pandemic, an unprecedented number of closures occurred, this is what I mean. It truly was unprecedented. Okay. So that was all that I had prepared today. I think I got in time. Yeah, that's fine. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here. And Katie, did you, were there any questions or did you want me to reiterate or go back and just look at anything else?
2 questions for you. The first is, are banks, can you hear me, Jason?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Are banks required to collect demographic data? And then the second is, does the data include credit unions?
So the data on credit unions, it is included in the mortgage data that we use. The bank branch locations, no, I'm not looking at credit union locations there. We can access credit union data from NCUA. So if anybody, if a member of NCRC has specific questions about credit unions, let me know. The Fair Lending tool does include credit union data as well. The question about demographic data, I'm not sure I understand. Banks do collect demographic data, for example, on lending. And there are certain exceptions where they can't, if a borrower refuses to give demographic data, and I'm starting, say if I'm the borrower and I'm starting my loan application on the internet, the bank is not required to get demographic data from me. They have to ask me, but I don't have to offer it. If I go in person or if I call a loan officer at a bank and I refuse to give them demographic data, the loan officer is required to guess essentially what my race and ethnicity is. So they are asked to, but we're seeing a general increase in the number of loan records that lack demographic data that is particularly troubling. So we are pushing CFPB to crack down on this.
And are banks required to collect demographic data?
That was what I think I was just answering. I think it was, I think they're asking about loan activity. Now, when it comes to branch closures, banks do pay attention to race and ethnicity of the neighborhoods where they're opening and closing branches. They're because they do get the Community Reinvestment Act will require that they pass what's called a service test, and disproportionate closures can negatively impact them. But in practice, neighborhoods that are in particular low to moderate income and high minority neighborhoods have very few branches to begin with. So for example, if I'm a bank and I'm only closing 2 branches and one's in a white neighborhood and one's in a majority minority neighborhood, it looks like I'm doing things equitably. But the white neighborhood probably has 5 or 6 branches total. So losing one isn't that big of a deal. Whereas my branch might be the only one located in a high minority neighborhood. So it's a situation where equitable closures have an unequitable impact. And, so that's what I'm concerned with when I look at that map of Toledo and I see closures in both higher income and lower income neighborhoods, but I only see openings in the higher income neighborhoods. So that's what I would be paying particular attention to, is who's opening branches and where are they?
Thanks. I have 2 more questions for you before we go into our next part. One, how can we help champion rules and regulations to ensure all lenders are forthcoming with data?
That's a great question. First, you want to go ahead and sign on to comment letters to the CFPB or other regulators. A lot of these rules are on the books, and it's just a matter of keeping pressure on regulators to enforce them and collect the data. HMDA, the mortgage data has a couple of glaring loopholes that we're hoping CFPB will close, with a new rulemaking this summer. If you're interested, please sign up for updates from NCRC. And when we start rolling on these comment letters, we'll let you know, and you can sign on to them yourself and help with that pressure.
Okay. And then the last question, are there examples in the country where previously underserved communities are trending positively?
Not great examples that I'm aware of. And it's difficult to make a blanket statement like that. But generally speaking, areas that were redlined in the 30s today are overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic and lower income. And they continue to suffer from the ongoing problems of a lack of investment and worse health outcomes. There are counterexamples. Every community probably has them, but overwhelmingly the story there is that the redlining has an effect. And the reason I'd spend so much time talking about the FHA maps is that even cities that didn't have HOLC maps, newer cities, we often see these same patterns due to the FHA using these same methods for so long.
And Jason, I don't know if you know anything about the infrastructure bill and the impact of that and on Black developers.
No, I'm excited about it. Anything that's flowing that is earmarked for areas that were formerly redlined is a positive step. I wonder if it's enough, and I wonder if it's going to be an investment that has long-term benefits. Honestly, I don't know enough about the infrastructure bill to answer that question.
All right. Well, cool. Jason, thank you so much for this information. I think it's a really good foundation and a good segue for where we're getting ready to go to next. One of the reasons why I thought it was important for you to share this information is because as we think about our goals and objectives and our measurable outcomes for our action plan, we have to be intentional, because there was intentionality in creating some of the communities that exist today. And the impact of those communities are a result of that intentionality. So if we're intentional about the work that we're doing around TREC, then we could possibly reverse some of that, some of those impacts. So thank you, Jason. Again, I'm always excited to hear from you and the work that you're doing at NCRC. And I will let you go.
All right. Sounds great. It was great to see everybody again. Katie, I can't wait to see you in June at the conference.